The door to the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office swung open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and every man inside reached for iron before they even saw who it was. They saw soon enough. Daniel Holloway stood in the doorway with the late afternoon sun burning behind him like the whole West was on fire, and he kept both hands raised just high enough to show he hadn't drawn, though everyone in that room knew he could clear leather before any one of them blinked. 6'2" of barely contained fury, a week's worth of dark stubble on a jaw that looked carved from granite, and eyes the color of a winter storm rolling in off the mountains. He wore a long riding duster the color of dried blood and a Colt single-action army on each hip, and the badge pinned to nothing because men like Daniel Holloway did not wear badges. Sheriff Roy Cutter sat behind his desk with his hand frozen on the grip of his Remington, and for one breathless moment the entire room existed in perfect, terrifying stillness. Then Daniel spoke, and his voice was quiet in the way that tornadoes are quiet before they touch down. "Release her," he said. "Because I am the one you actually want." Roy Cutter stared at him. Deputy Hank Willis stared at him. The two hired guns leaning against the far wall stared at him. And from behind the iron-barred door at the back of the room, a sharp breath cut through the silence like a blade. "Daniel." Her voice was raw, scraped hollow from a night in that cell, but it carried everything: warning, fury, and something else, something she had spent the better part of 6 months trying to bury so deep it would never surface again. "Don't you dare." He didn't look at her. He kept those storm-gray eyes locked on Roy Cutter with the focused calm of a man who had already made his decision and would not be talked out of it. "You've been hunting me for 2 years, Daniel said. "She doesn't know a single thing worth knowing. Let her walk out of here and I'll give you everything you want. I'll go quiet." The word quiet coming out of Daniel Holloway's mouth in that context was almost enough to make a man laugh. Almost. Roy Cutter, to his credit, did not laugh. He was a careful man, Roy was, and careful men did not live long in places like Redemption Creek if they made the mistake of laughing at the wrong moment. "Everything I want," Roy repeated slowly, tasting the words. "You mean yourself in irons?" "I mean myself in irons," Daniel confirmed. "And the location of the Holloway gang's winter cache, $47,000 in railroad gold." The two hired guns against the wall stopped being casual in an instant. Daniel stopped talking. Belle Callahan's voice had gone from raw to steel. "Don't you say another word. Roy Cutter, you let me out of this cell right now. You have nothing on me and you know it. I was in that bank making a legitimate deposit and you arrested me because your leverage," Roy said, and the honesty of it was almost refreshing in its ugliness. He looked at Daniel. "You've got nerve walking in here alone." "I'm not here to negotiate nerve," Daniel said. "I'm here to make a trade." And that was the moment, that exact crystalline instant when Belle Callahan, schoolteacher, formerly of St. Louis, Missouri, pressed her forehead against the cold iron bars of that cell and felt something she had been running from since the first time she laid eyes on Daniel Holloway tear completely loose from its moorings inside her chest. She had told herself so many things. She had told herself he was dangerous, which was true. She had told herself he was trouble the way a drought was trouble, the kind that burned everything in its path. She had told herself that a woman like her had no business feeling anything for a man like him, that the 6 months she had spent in Redemption Creek, rebuilding something resembling a respectable life, were worth protecting, that she had worked too hard and come too far to let one pair of storm-gray eyes and one reckless, impossible man dismantle everything she had built. She had told herself all of those things. And now she was watching him trade his freedom for hers, and every single one of those carefully constructed arguments turned to dust. It had started, as most things in Redemption Creek started, with something ordinary pretending to be extraordinary. 6 months earlier, in the last week of September in the year 1882, Belle Callahan had arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas on the afternoon stage from El Paso. She was 24 years old, possessed of a schoolteacher's certificate from the Missouri State Normal School, a single leather trunk containing everything she owned, and approximately $11 in her coin purse after the fare. She had not intended to stop in Redemption Creek. She had been bound for Tucson, where a teaching position had been arranged through correspondence with the territory's education board. But the stage had lost a wheel axle 8 miles out of town, and while the driver and his shotgun rider worked to effect repairs, Belle had walked into Redemption Creek for what she intended to be a brief meal and a cup of coffee. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that felt like it was holding its breath. Wide Main Street, 2-story saloon, a church that had been started and never quite finished, a general store that smelled of tobacco and harness leather, and the particular dusty sweetness of dried goods. A livery stable, the sheriff's office. A small schoolhouse that Belle had noticed immediately, with the professional appraisal of a woman who had been trained to notice such things, and which appeared to have been empty for some time based on the weathering of the shutters. She had her coffee and her meal at the small restaurant run by a woman named Clara Pruitt, and Clara, who was the kind of woman who could smell opportunity the way a hawk could spot a mouse, had asked Belle within the first 10 minutes whether she was a teacher. "We've been without one since Mrs. Henderson left for her sister's place in Austin back in the spring," Clara said, sliding another cup of coffee across the counter without being asked. 23 children in this town between the ages of 6 and 14, with nowhere to be during the day and nothing useful to learn. Their parents are getting desperate, I can tell you that. The town council offered to write to the education board in September, but they haven't had a response. Belle had looked out the window at the dusty street, and the unfinished church and the schoolhouse with its weathered shutters, and she had felt the thing she always felt when she saw a place that needed something she could give. She had missed the afternoon stage. Whether that was accident or decision, she had never entirely been able to say. Within 3 days, she had a teaching contract with the Redemption Creek Town Council, a small room above Clara's restaurant, and 17 children showing up on the first morning with the wary excitement of young people who have been granted unexpected structure. By the end of the first week, she had all 23. She had not met Daniel Holloway for 2 more weeks after that. The circumstances of that meeting were, in retrospect, exactly as predictable as they were improbable. She had been riding home from a supply run to the McReady farm, 7 miles outside of town, because the McReady children were too young yet for school, but their mother had asked Belle if she might bring primers out on occasion for the eldest boy, who was 5 and desperately curious. Belle had borrowed a bay mare from the livery and was making good time back toward town when the mare threw a shoe on the rocky ground near Cutter's Creek, which everyone called that because Roy Cutter's family had originally settled that land before Roy's older brother lost it in a card game 20 years ago, and Roy had never entirely gotten over it. Belle had dismounted and was walking the mare carefully toward the road, weighing the remaining daylight against the distance, when she heard horses. 3 of them, moving fast, coming from the direction of the old Donner Pass Road. Not the Donner Pass out in California, just a local geological feature that shared the name accidentally. She had stepped well off the road with her horse, the way any sensible person did when fast-moving riders appeared on a lonely stretch of Texas scrubland in the fading afternoon, and watched them come. They were not heading for her. They were heading for somewhere past her, riding hard with the particular focus of men who have somewhere urgent to be. 2 of them passed within 30 yards without glancing in her direction. The third one's horse stumbled. Not badly, not a fall, but a stumble serious enough that the rider checked the animal immediately, circling back, jumping down to check the foreleg in the gathering dusk. And when he straightened and looked around to reorient himself, he saw Belle standing in the scrub with a lame horse and the calm, appraising expression of someone who has decided that whatever was happening in front of her was probably going to require careful management. He was the most dangerous-looking man she had ever seen. She knew it the way you know a storm is dangerous, not from evidence exactly, but from some deep ancestral instinct that predates reason. The way he moved, the way he scanned the landscape, the two guns on his hips worn with the kind of ease that meant they were not ornamental. "Your horse throw a shoe," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the mare, then at her, then at the road ahead where his companions had disappeared into the dusk. "How far to town?" 4 miles. He considered this. Then he walked his horse to a flat rock, checked the foreleg one more time with the careful attention of someone who genuinely knew horses, and then looked back at her. "I can take you to town," he said. "You can ride." "I don't know you," Belle said. "No," he agreed without any particular defensiveness. "You don't. That's generally considered a reason not to accept rides from someone. It's also a reason not to walk 4 miles through scrub in the dark with a lame horse," he said. "Your choice." She had looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face, she thought later, that was not comfortable to look at directly. Not because it was frightening exactly, though it was that too, but because there was something in it that felt like truth in the way that very few faces did, a kind of absolute absence of performance. He wasn't trying to seem trustworthy. He wasn't performing safety. He was simply standing there being exactly what he was and offering her a practical solution and leaving the decision entirely with her. She handed him the mare's reins. She rode his horse. He walked alongside her, leading the lame mare, and for the first mile they said nothing at all. The silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had spent most of her adult life in the company of people who could not tolerate silence and filled it compulsively with words that meant nothing, and she had found it exhausting. This was different. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said finally. "Yes. How did you know that?" "Small town," he said. "News travels." "Are you from Redemption Creek?" A slight pause. "Not exactly, but you know of it." "I know of most places in this part of Texas," he said. She thought about that. "What's your name?" Another pause, longer this time, and she thought he was going to decline, and then he said, "Daniel, just Daniel, no surname." She noted the absence. "Belle Callahan," she offered. He looked up at her then from where he was walking, and something shifted in his face. Not softened exactly. More like a very briefly opened window before it closed again. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Appropriate. Is it?" "Belle means beautiful in French," he said. "It fits." She felt heat climb her face in the dark where he couldn't see it and was grateful for that. They reached the edge of town, where the first lamps were being lit in windows and the sound of the saloon piano was beginning to drift out into the evening air. He handed her back the mare's reins and took his horse. "Thank you," she said. "Don't walk alone near Cutter's Creek after dark," he said. "It's not safe territory." "Noted," she said. "Whose territory is it?" He was already mounting. He looked down at her with those gray eyes that she was absolutely not going to think about after this. "Mine," he said, and rode away. She had asked around the next day, as carefully and casually as she could manage, and had gotten her answer in pieces from different people, none of whom offered it cheerfully. Daniel Holloway, the Holloway gang, most wanted man in 3 Texas counties and reportedly in 2 others as well. Train robberies primarily, and 1 bank job in Laredo 2 years back that had become the stuff of local legend, because not a single person had been harmed despite $40,000 walking out the front door. Railroad gold stolen and vanished. A 2-year manhunt by the combined efforts of the Pinkerton Agency and the Texas Rangers that had produced exactly nothing. And Roy Cutter, who was the sheriff of Redemption Creek and had a complicated personal history with the Holloway family that predated Daniel's outlaw career, had made capturing Daniel Holloway into something approaching a personal crusade. Belle had filed this information carefully and told herself that she would not think about him again. That resolution lasted approximately 4 days. Because on the 5th day after their meeting, she found a horseshoe nail on her desk at the schoolhouse, placed on top of a small piece of paper on which someone had written, in a clean, careful hand, "For the mare." She had stood there holding that scrap of paper for longer than was entirely sensible. After that, things developed in the way things develop when 2 people are trying very hard not to let them develop, which is to say, they developed anyway, only more slowly and with more internal argument from both parties. She began to see him occasionally, never in town, never anywhere it could be observed by Roy Cutter or Roy Cutter's deputies, or the various eyes that fed information to Roy Cutter because Roy paid for information. Always on the edges, in the scrubland outside of town, or twice at the Macready farm, where the Macready family turned out to have complicated relationships with the concept of law enforcement and no particular opinions about Daniel Holloway that were unfavorable. The first time it was accidental, or almost so. She was returning from the Macready farm, and he was watering his horse at the creek, and they had looked at each other across 20 yards of scrub grass, and there had been that same quality of silence that was not uncomfortable. "Your horse has all 4 shoes," he observed. "The blacksmith did good work," she said. "Thank you for the nail." "Couldn't have a schoolteacher walking 4 miles of scrub," he said. "It sets a bad example." She laughed, and she saw the effect of it on his face, and then she watched him work very hard to put that effect away somewhere it didn't show. The second time was deliberate, and she knew it was deliberate, and she suspected he knew she knew, and the entire encounter proceeded on the polite fiction that they had both happened to be in the same location entirely by coincidence. He asked her about St. Louis. She told him about it. She asked him where he was from, and he told her slowly and in pieces about a ranch north of Abilene that didn't exist anymore, about a father who had been a decent man and a mother who had been extraordinary, about an older brother named Thomas who had gone to war in 1864 and not come back the same way he'd left. "What happened to the ranch?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Tax seizure," he said, "when I was 19. My father died the winter before, and the county assessor came out and said the taxes were in arrears. I had the money. I had saved it. I went to the county office to pay it, and they told me the property had already been transferred." He paused. "Transferred to a holding company owned by the regional director of the Southern Pacific Railroad." The story landed in the space between them with the weight of an entire history. "That's when it started," she said. It was not a question. "That's when it started," he confirmed. She understood then with perfect clarity that she was in considerable trouble of the emotional variety because she understood him. Not excused, not approved of, but understood in the deep way that you understand something that rhymes with your own experience. She had come from St. Louis because her father had been a teacher who died of fever when she was 16, and her mother had gone to work in a textile mill, and the mill owner had paid in company scrip that could only be spent at the company store, and Belle had worked nights and saved real money and bought her way out with a scholarship application and sheer determined fury. She understood what it meant when the system that was supposed to protect you was the thing that destroyed you. She did not say any of this to him, not yet, but she thought about it for a long time afterward. October became November, and November became December, and the Texas winter settled in, not the killing cold of the northern plains, but a hard, dry, biting cold that came off the plateaus and made people hunch into themselves. Belle's classroom was warm with a good iron stove and 23 children who generated substantial body heat, and she loved her work with a fierceness that surprised her sometimes, the way loving anything surprised her. She saw Daniel twice in November and once in December, and each time the conversations went deeper and the silences were more comfortable, and the thing between them that had no name yet took on more weight and more definition. On a cold December afternoon with the light going gold and flat across the scrubland, he had looked at her and said, "You should know that whatever this is, I can't offer you anything respectable." "I'm aware of that," she said. "I mean it plainly. I'm a wanted man. I live outside the law. That doesn't change." "I haven't asked it to change," she said. "You should want it to change," he said, and there was something fierce in it, something that she recognized as care, as the kind of care that pushes away in order to protect. "Daniel," she said, "I am a woman who makes her own decisions. I appreciate that you're trying to be honest with me. I am also trying to be honest with you. I did not choose to have feelings for you. I'm not entirely happy about it, but I am not going to pretend they aren't there." He stared at her. She stared back. He said, "Belle," and his voice was different on her name than it was on any other word, lower and more deliberate, like he was being careful with it. "Yes," she said. "I need you to understand that I would rather die than have you come to harm because of me." "That is a very dramatic thing to say," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "It's the truth." She believed him. That was the problem. She believed him absolutely, with the certainty that she brought to things that were factually verifiable. And the believing was what finally undid her last remaining reasonable objection, because a man who would rather die than see you harmed was not a man you could continue to argue yourself out of caring about. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was not guarded at all, something that was open and almost young, and that she thought he had been protecting for a very long time. "This is a terrible idea," he said. "Absolutely," she agreed. He raised his eyes to hers, and she saw, with the clear, unflinching certainty of someone who had spent 6 months refusing to look, that he was completely and irreversibly in love with her. She thought he probably saw the same thing looking back. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair. Clara Pruitt organized a dinner at the restaurant for anyone who had no family nearby, and Belle sat between Clara and old Ezekiel Ward, who was 70 and had come to Texas from Tennessee in 1845 and had opinions about everything. And she ate good food and listened to Ezekiel's stories and thought about Daniel Holloway with an ache that had become so familiar she'd almost stopped noticing it. She had made him a gift. This was something she had argued herself out of 3 times before doing anyway. A small leather-bound journal, because in all their conversations she had come to understand that he was a man who thought deeply and had no one to think alongside, and she thought a journal might serve that purpose in her absence. She had left it at the Macready farm with a note inside the front cover. She didn't hear from him for 2 weeks and spent those 2 weeks telling herself this was fine, that she had expected nothing, that she had no right to expect anything, and generally conducting an internal argument with herself that was exhausting and unproductive. And then on a Sunday morning in the first week of January 1883, she found a small package on the windowsill of her room, left there by means she could not entirely account for since her window was on the 2nd floor. Inside was a pressed wildflower, a type she recognized as being native to the high desert plateaus north of town, somewhere she had never been. And a note, written in that same clean, careful hand. It said, "I have been thinking about what you said in December. You are the bravest woman I have ever known. The flower grew somewhere I would like to show you when it is safe to do so." She read it 4 times. She pressed it into her own journal, the one she had brought from St. Louis. She went to church, even though the church didn't have a roof, and sat on one of the rough pews under the open Texas sky and felt something she had not felt in a long time. It felt like hope. January was when Roy Cutter began to pay attention. She didn't know this right away. She noticed small things first. A deputy she didn't recognize sitting in the restaurant during school hours, watching the street. A question from Roy himself, delivered with his trademark careful politeness, about whether she had noticed any strangers in the area. A general tightening of something in the town's atmosphere, a collective held breath that she felt but could not immediately explain. She found out the source of it from Clara in early February, delivered over coffee with the quiet gravity of someone sharing something important. "Roy Cutter got word from a Pinkerton man," Clara said. "Holloway's gang hit a Southern Pacific payroll outside of San Antonio in December. Took $60,000. Killed no one, but one of Pinkerton's men got a decent look at 2 of the gang members. Roy thinks they're operating out of this region." "Why would they operate out of this region specifically?" Belle asked, and was very proud of how steady her voice was. "Roy's had suspicions for a while," Clara said. "He thinks Holloway has connections here, someone supplying them maybe, or someone they trust." Belle set down her coffee cup very carefully. "He's been asking questions," Clara continued, watching Belle's face with the sharp attention of a woman who had seen a great deal in her time. About newcomers mostly, people who arrived in the last year. The silence lasted exactly as long as it took Belle to decide that Clara deserved honesty. "Clara," she said. "I don't want to know the particulars," Clara said immediately. "I want you to be careful. Roy Cutter is not a bad man exactly, but he's a man with a grudge, and that makes him dangerous in ways that a straightforwardly bad man isn't." "I understand," Belle said. "Do you?" Clara said gently. "Do you understand that he would use you if he thought it would get him what he wanted?" Belle understood. She took greater precautions after that. The meetings with Daniel, already infrequent by necessity, became more so. They communicated through the careful system they had developed. Small items left at the McCready farm with notes. The farm family, whose patriarch Clem McCready had his own reasons to distrust the law and the railroad alike, serving as willing intermediaries. But February became March, and March became April, and the thing between them kept growing in the way things grow when they are left mostly to silence and small gestures, and the particular intensity that comes from people who cannot be together as freely as they wish. He had kissed her once, in early March, in the blue hour just before sunset in the scrubland east of town, and it had been nothing like the careful, measured experience she might have expected from a man so controlled. It had been entirely honest, with all the accumulated weight of 4 months and everything that had been said and unsaid between them, and when they separated and looked at each other she had felt him shaking and had understood that whatever this cost him, it cost him the way only things that truly mattered could. "I don't know how this ends well," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "Not yet. But you're not running." "I have never been a woman who runs," she said. "You've had enough time to observe that." Something in his face shifted, deep and permanent, like a final lock giving way. "I love you," he said. Flat, direct, no flourish, the way he said everything true. "I know," she said. "I love you too." April was when the trap was set, though she didn't know it was a trap until it had already closed. It began with what seemed like good news. Roy Cutter announced publicly, at the town council meeting in the first week of April, that the Pinkerton investigation had moved on. A tip had taken the agency toward New Mexico territory, he said. The heightened vigilance in Redemption Creek would be relaxed. There was no longer believed to be a significant Holloway presence in the region. She had felt relief, sharp and warm, and had done nothing with it yet, had waited, had watched, because something in her schoolteacher's brain that had been trained to notice when children were performing rather than actually feeling something caught a note of performance in Roy Cutter's public announcement. She waited 2 weeks. Then she sent word through the McCready farm that she thought it might be safe to meet. She should have trusted her instincts. She understood that afterward. Because Roy Cutter had never relaxed his vigilance, he had merely announced that he had. And the man he had watching the McCready farm had seen the handoff, had seen Belle's note passed to Clem McCready, and from Clem McCready to the writer who came twice a month on no particular schedule. And Roy Cutter, who was a careful man with a long memory and a detailed personal grudge, had spent 2 weeks following the thread. He had not found Daniel. Nobody found Daniel when Daniel didn't want to be found. But he had found enough of the thread to know where it led, and he had made his decision with the cold efficiency of a man who had waited 2 years for an opportunity. He had arrested Belle on a Tuesday morning in the first week of May at the bank, where she had gone to make a deposit of her teaching salary, charging her with conspiracy to harbor and aid a known fugitive. The evidence was thin. The evidence was almost laughably thin. But it didn't need to be strong in a town where Roy Cutter controlled the magistrate's schedule, where a woman sitting in a jail cell was not a woman who could send word through the McCready farm, and where Roy Cutter was absolutely certain that the news of her arrest would reach Daniel Holloway within 48 hours. He was right. It reached Daniel in under 36. And Daniel Holloway, who had told her once that he would rather die than have her come to harm because of him, had ridden to Redemption Creek alone and walked through the door of Roy Cutter's office with both hands raised just high enough to show he hadn't drawn, and he had said the words that changed everything. Release her. Because I am the one you actually want. Standing in that office with the afternoon sun at his back, and Roy Cutter's hand on his gun, and Belle's voice sharp as a blade through the bars of her cell, Daniel waited. Roy looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man calculating odds. 47,000 in railroad gold, Roy said slowly. You give me the location. I'd give you the location, Daniel said. And myself, freely given. You can tell the Pinkertons you caught me. You can tell them whatever story suits you. Daniel, stop, Belle said from behind the bars, and her voice was absolutely furious and absolutely terrified, and he still would not look at her because if he looked at her he knew he would not be able to hold steady. Why would you do this? Roy said. Because she has nothing to do with what I've done, Daniel said. She made a mistake in caring about me. That's not criminal. She doesn't know where I've been or what I've taken or who I've ridden with. You can hold her a year and you won't get information she doesn't have, but I will give you everything you've been chasing for 2 years freely if you let her walk out of here. Roy Cutter was quiet for a long time. How do I know you won't run the minute she's clear? You don't, Daniel said, except that you know enough about me by now to know that when I give my word I keep it. There was another silence, the kind that had weight and momentum. Roy Cutter, Belle said, and her voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow more frightening than when it was sharp. If you take this trade, you are a coward and a fool. You cannot legally hold me. You have no evidence. And if you think for 1 second that I will let this stand, Miss Callahan, Roy said, not taking his eyes off Daniel, you don't have a great deal of say in this at present. I have enormous say, she said. I have the say of a woman who will walk out of this territory and go directly to the federal circuit judge in Austin and file every complaint available to her under the laws of the United States of America. And I will do it whether you let me out now or in a week when you have to let me out anyway because you have no grounds to hold me. The only question is whether I file those complaints before or after you've made the worst mistake of your career. Roy looked at her. She looked back through the bars with the absolute blazing certainty of someone who knows the law thoroughly and is not bluffing. Roy looked back at Daniel. The gold location, he said. On paper signed once she's out the door, Daniel said. A very long pause. Roy stood up and reached for his keys. Hank, he said, go get the justice of the peace. Belle came out of that cell with her spine straight and her head up, and the barely controlled fury of a woman who has been locked in a box for 36 hours wearing her like armor. She walked past Roy Cutter without looking at him, and she walked past Deputy Hank Willis without looking at him, and she walked past the 2 hired guns against the wall without looking at them, and she stopped in front of Daniel Holloway. She looked at him for one moment, just one, with everything in her face. Then she said very quietly, "Don't you dare give him that location." He said just as quietly, "Belle, don't," she said. "Whatever you're planning, don't. Get clear of town," he said. "Go to the Macready farm." "I am not going anywhere without Belle." He said her name like a door closing. "Please." She stared at him. He met her eyes with that absolute honesty that she had never been able to argue against, and she saw, behind the calm, that he had a plan. Something he wasn't saying in front of Roy Cutter and his deputies. Something that relied on her being clear of this room. She walked out of the sheriff's office into the Texas afternoon and did not look back. She did not go to the Macready farm immediately. She went to Clara Pruitt's restaurant, because Clara's restaurant had a back room with a window that faced the sheriff's office at an angle, and because Belle Callahan was not a woman who went quietly away from a situation and waited to find out what happened. She watched from that window for the next 40 minutes with Clara standing silently beside her, and she thought very carefully about everything she knew. The thing she knew most clearly was that Daniel Holloway did not intend to give Roy Cutter the location of any railroad gold. She knew this not because she knew exactly what plan he was executing, but because she knew him, and the man she knew was not a man who broke faith with his people. The Holloway gang, whatever else could be said about them, were people who trusted Daniel with their lives, and he would not betray them. What he was doing, she was increasingly certain, was buying time and opportunity. Roy Cutter did not keep his office paperwork in the office. This was a fact she had established during a conversation with Deputy Hank Willis at Clara's restaurant 2 months ago, when Hank had been on his third beer and feeling expansive. Cutter kept his important files at his house, which was on the south end of town, because he didn't trust the security of the office, which had been broken into twice in the past 4 years. One of those break-ins, she was fairly certain, had been conducted by Daniel's people, looking for exactly the kind of information that would tell them how much Roy knew and what he was planning. She turned away from the window and looked at Clara. "I need to think through something," she said. "Think quickly," Clara said. "That justice of the peace will be there in another 10 minutes." She thought very quickly. And then she went to see the one person in Redemption Creek who had reason to help her and the means to do so quickly. And that person was Clem Macready's son-in-law, a man named Julio Garza, who was 17 and fast as a coyote and owed Belle Callahan a considerable debt of gratitude because she had taught him to read the previous autumn, and he had told her once, with the earnest sincerity of youth, that he would do anything she asked. She asked him to ride. The note she sent through Julio reached Daniel's second-in-command, a man she had never met but had heard described as Thomas Reeves, within an hour. She did not know exactly where it went after that. She only knew what happened next, and what happened next was something she would spend years afterward describing to people who didn't quite believe it. What happened was that Roy Cutter, sitting behind his desk with Daniel Holloway in a chair across from him, and the justice of the peace on his way, and the paper and pen laid out for the recording of the gold's location, had his attention pulled by a sudden and extraordinary distraction in the street. 2 horses had gotten loose from the hitching post outside the saloon. This was not itself extraordinary. What was extraordinary was that they had gotten loose in a way that involved knocking over the rain barrel outside the general store, which had cascaded into a shelf of goods inside the door of the general store, which had produced a tremendous crash of tin goods and a great deal of shouting, and the chaos that follows when a confined space suddenly has a great deal of noise and motion in it. Roy turned to the window. Both deputies turned to the window. Daniel Holloway was out of his chair and through the back door of the sheriff's office in approximately 3.5 seconds. He was on a horse that was waiting in the alley behind the office in another 5. Roy Cutter, to his very considerable fury, discovered this about 8 seconds after it happened. The pursuit that followed lasted the better part of 2 hours, covered a great deal of difficult terrain, and ended in the rocky high ground north of Redemption Creek, where a man who knew the country well and a man who was following someone who knew it well were at a profound disadvantage. By the time Roy Cutter and his deputies returned to town with their horses blown and their dignity in ruins, Daniel Holloway had vanished into the landscape with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been doing exactly this for 2 years. Belle was sitting in Clara's restaurant when Roy Cutter came through the door. She was drinking coffee and going over the next week's lesson plans with the focused attention of a woman who has nothing to hide and know where she needs to be. Roy looked at her for a long time. "Convenient distraction," he said. "I heard the noise," she said pleasantly. "Those 2 horses made a real mess of Mr. Henderson's goods." "You're going to tell me you had nothing to do with that?" "I was sitting here, Mr. Cutter. Clara can confirm it." "I can," Clara said from behind the counter, with the bland helpfulness of a woman who had seen everything and could prove nothing. Roy Cutter sat down across from Belle with the expression of a man who knows he has been outwitted but cannot prove it. "This isn't finished," he said. "Mr. Cutter," Belle said, setting down her pen with precise calmness, "I spent a night and a day in your jail cell on charges you knew were speculative at best and fabricated at worst. I am a schoolteacher with a clean record and 17 children who need to be in school tomorrow morning. I would strongly recommend that you consider whether continuing to pursue a personal vendetta against a man by targeting people peripheral to him is the best use of your official capacity. She held his gaze steadily. He held hers back. Then he stood, put his hat on, and walked out. That night past midnight, she heard the soft sound of gravel against her second-floor window. She opened it to find Daniel below in the shadow of the building, and the expression on his face when he looked up at her was one she had never seen there before. Something stripped bare, something that the day and its events had scoured down to its essential truth. She went down the back stairs in her housecoat, and they stood in the alley in the dark, and she looked at him. "Are you hurt?" she asked first, because that was the first thing. "No," he said. "Good," she said. A silence. "I want to be angry with you," she said. "You have every right to be," he said. "You walked in there alone. You offered yourself in the gold. You were going to—" She stopped because her voice was not going to cooperate if she continued. "I was not going to let you sit in that cell," he said simply. "And the plan, the distraction, was that always I had to give Reeves time to get people in position," he said. "The confession was theater. I needed Roy focused on me and on the paper for long enough. You could not have told me this before. I nearly made myself sick with worry. I couldn't tell you anything in front of Roy without giving it away," he said. "And the note you sent Julio," he paused. "You figured it out." "I know you," she said. "That's the whole problem." He stepped toward her and she let him, and he held her face in both hands with that particular careful reverence that he reserved for her alone, and she felt the slight tremor in his hands that he would never acknowledge, but that told her exactly what the day had cost him. "Belle," he said. "Yes," she said. "I cannot keep doing this to you," he said. "I cannot keep asking you to live on the edge of something that could collapse at any moment. Roy Cutter is not done. The Pinkertons are not done. There will be another Roy Cutter in another town, if not this one." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking," he said. "For a long time, actually, before today. There's land in New Mexico territory, north of Santa Fe up toward the mountains. Remote, good grazing, not under any name anyone would recognize." She went very still. "Thomas Reeves has family in the territory," he said. "He's been telling me for a year that there's a way out. That there's a life on the other side of all of this if a man wants to find it badly enough to do the work of getting there. Honest work, or as close to it as I can come. It wouldn't be like this." He gestured at the alley, the shadows, the silence that had to be maintained. "It wouldn't be hiding." "What are you asking me?" she said very quietly. "I'm asking you," he said, "whether you would be willing to go there with me, whether you would be willing to start something new with me, whether—" He stopped. He looked at her with all that stripped honesty. "I'm asking you to marry me, Belle, properly, with a minister, with your name and mine on paper together. I'm asking you to build something real." The Texas night was very quiet around them. The stars were extraordinary, the way they always were this far from the city. Somewhere down the street the saloon piano had gone silent. She was aware that she was crying, which was annoying, because she was not a woman who cried easily, and she preferred to maintain that reputation. "That is," she said, "the most impractical, complicated, dangerous proposal any woman in the history of the American West has ever received." "Yes," he said, "there are at least 11 things that could go terribly wrong between here and New Mexico territory." "At least," he agreed. She reached up and covered his hands with hers, where they were still holding her face. "Yes," she said. The next 3 weeks were among the most logistically complex of Belle Callahan's life, which was saying something for a woman who had organized a curriculum for 23 children of mixed ages and abilities in a single-room schoolhouse. She had responsibilities in Redemption Creek that she would not simply abandon. She gave the town council 4 weeks' notice, wrote up a complete set of lesson plans and materials for the next 4 months, and sat down with the 3 most capable parents on the council to identify who among the older children might serve as an effective monitor, until a permanent replacement was found. She wrote a letter to the Missouri State Normal School requesting that they identify candidates for the position. She said goodbye to Clara Pruitt on the last morning over coffee, and Clara held her hands across the counter and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had seen the shape of this coming for months and had made her peace with it. "Will you be safe?" Clara asked. "I believe so," Belle said. I believe he will make sure of it." "I believe that too," Clara said. "I've seen the way that man looks at you, Belle. God help him, he is absolutely gone on you." Belle laughed, though it came out unsteady. "The feeling is mutual." "Write to me when you're settled," Clara said. "I won't tell a soul where." "I will," Belle promised. She kept that promise. They left Redemption Creek on a Thursday morning in the last week of May 1883, with the sun not yet fully up and the air carrying the last breath of night's coolness. Daniel and Belle and Thomas Reeves, who turned out to be a compact, red-haired man of 30 who moved very quietly and had the particular calm of someone who has thought carefully about every contingency. They rode north and west, through country that opened up in ways that Texas sometimes did, vast and raw and beautiful, with the vicious, indifferent beauty of a landscape that had been old before human beings had opinions about it. Roy Cutter's jurisdiction ended at the county line, and the Pinkerton agents who might have been following were not in evidence. Thomas Reeves, who had planned their route with meticulous care, had chosen roads and crossing points that avoided the major rail stations and the towns where wanted posters were most recently posted. They were in New Mexico territory by the 7th day. The land north of Santa Fe was everything Daniel had described. High and clean, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising to the east and a valley of extraordinary beauty stretching between low hills covered in pinon pine and juniper. The air at that elevation was cool even in late May, and had a quality that Belle could only describe as transparent, like breathing through pure glass. Thomas Reeves's family was there, a cousin and her husband who had built a working ranch on 200 acres over the past decade, and they received Daniel and Belle with the matter-of-fact hospitality of people who understand that lives sometimes require radical reconstruction and see no point in asking unnecessary questions. The cousin's husband, a man named Abel Reeves, had connections with the local land office, and within 10 days a parcel of land adjacent to the Reeves property had been registered under the name Daniel Holloway, which was a name that had no outstanding warrants attached to it, and that Daniel wore with the slightly self-conscious air of a man wearing a new suit for the first time. Belle found the minister in the small town of Cimarron, 12 miles east, on the first Sunday of June. He was a lean, sunburned man named Reverend Joseph Aldridge, who had been conducting services in the territory for 15 years, and who had married people in all manner of circumstances, and had learned not to inquire too closely into the details of lives that came to him for sacrament. He looked at Belle and Daniel with steady eyes, and asked only the questions the ceremony required. They were married on a Tuesday afternoon in the cool shadow of the pinon pines behind the Reeves ranch, with Thomas and Abel and Thomas's cousin Margaret as witnesses, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as a backdrop that no church could have bettered. When Reverend Aldridge said the words and Daniel put the ring on her finger, Belle felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with geology. She looked up at him and found him watching her with those gray eyes that she had spent 9 months trying not to fall into, and she thought, here we are. Here, impossibly and actually, we are. He kissed her, and it was nothing like theater and nothing like performance. It was exactly what it was. Afterward, Thomas Reeves shook Daniel's hand for a long time without saying anything, and Margaret Reeves hugged Belle with the warm comprehensiveness of a woman who means it. And Abel Reeves produced a bottle of something he called territorial whiskey that may or may not have been legal, and they drank it as the sun went down over the mountains and turned the whole sky the color of hammered copper. That night, in the small 2-room house that would be theirs until they built something larger, Belle lay awake after Daniel slept and stared at the ceiling and took stock. She was 24 years old and a married woman in the New Mexico territory, with a new name on paper and a new life beginning, and she had come here from St. Louis by way of Redemption Creek, by way of every decision she had ever made, and none of those decisions, looking back, seemed like mistakes. They seemed like steps. She reached out in the dark and put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and present, and thought, This is the truest thing I have ever done." He covered her hand with his without waking. She closed her eyes. The building of the Harlow Ranch, as it came to be known in the valley, took the better part of 3 years, and every month of those years was a new kind of learning for both of them. Daniel threw himself into the work of ranching with the same focused intensity he had brought to everything else he had done in his life, which meant he was occasionally over-optimistic about timelines, and occasionally frustrated by weather, and occasionally driven to long silences by the particular challenges of building something legitimate from the ground up. But he was never idle, and he never asked anyone to do work he would not do himself, and the men they hired over time, drifters and former cowboys and one Apache man named Santiago who became their most valued hand, all understood this and responded to it. Belle did not stop teaching. The valley had children, and children needed teachers, and Belle Callahan, now Belle Harlow on the official papers, was a teacher by training and vocation and the deepest kind of calling. She started with 4 students in the kitchen of their house while the proper building went up, and by the second year she had 13 students in a proper one-room schoolhouse that Daniel and Abel Reeves built between them in the early spring. She loved watching him build things. This was an observation she kept to herself, because she recognized it as the kind of thing a woman who is deeply in love notices about the person she is deeply in love with, and she was not entirely above finding her own feelings slightly amusing. But there was something in watching him work with his hands, in watching the careful precision of a man who had spent years destroying things, now pouring that same precision into creation, that filled her with a specific variety of happiness she did not have another word for. Their first child was born in March of 1884, 10 months after their marriage, in the middle of a late-season snowfall that came off the mountains like a white curtain. It was a boy. They named him James William Harlow, James for Daniel's father and William for Belle's. And when Daniel held him for the first time in the dim light of the bedroom with the snow falling silent outside, he made no sound at all for almost a full minute. Belle watched his face from the bed, exhausted and elated and entirely undone by the expression she saw there, which was the most open and unguarded thing she had ever seen in another human being. "James," Daniel said finally, very quietly, trying out the name on his son, who regarded him with the ancient, unfocused attention of the very new. "He looks like you," Belle said. "He looks like a potato," Daniel said, and Belle laughed so hard that James startled and made his first serious noise of protest, and Daniel's eyes went wide with the particular alarm of a man encountering infant displeasure for the first time. "What do I do?" he said. "Hold him closer," she said. "He just wants to know you're there." He held his son closer, and James subsided, and Daniel looked up at Belle with an expression she would never forget if she lived to be 100. "I'm here," he said, and it was not clear whether he was speaking to the baby or to her, but it didn't matter because it was equally true either way. Thomas Reeves was godfather, which he accepted with such obvious pleasure that it made everyone in the room feel unreasonably fond of him. Margaret Reeves cried, which she denied afterward with vigor. The years settled into rhythms. The ranch grew, carefully and steadily, until by 1886 they were running 400 head of cattle and had a bunkhouse for 6 hands and a proper barn, and a kitchen garden that Belle tended with the same organized ferocity she brought to everything. And the house itself had grown from 2 rooms to 6, added one at a time as necessity and resources allowed. The question of the past was one that existed in the background always, like a low note held beneath a melody. Not oppressive, not daily, but present. Daniel had given Thomas Reeves, in the year after they left Redemption Creek, the actual location of the old winter cache, instructing Thomas to distribute it through channels that would restore it to the railroad without pointing any trail back to Daniel Harlow of New Mexico territory. This had been important to both of them. The gold that had been taken could not be personally returned, but it could be redirected, and the effort of doing so honestly was worth something, Daniel said, and Belle agreed. Thomas Reeves had managed it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and as far as either of them could determine, the Pinkerton investigation into the Holloway gang had gone gradually cold over the years as its principal members scattered, and the 2-year-old reward poster faded in windows throughout Texas and became, eventually, historical rather than current. Whether Roy Cutter had ever made the connection between Daniel Holloway and Daniel Harlow of New Mexico Territory, they never knew for certain. Roy Cutter remained sheriff of Redemption Creek for another 3 years after they left, and then retired, and the brief letter that Clara Pruitt wrote Belle in the fall of 1886 mentioned this fact with the careful neutrality of someone saying more than the words said. Belle had shown the letter to Daniel, and they had sat with it for a while. "Do you think he knows?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "Maybe," he said. "I think if Roy wanted to come for me, he would have come. I think there's a possibility that what happened in that office, when he opened the cell door, changed something." "You walked in and told him the truth," Belle said. "I told him what I was worth and what you weren't responsible for," Daniel said. "Whether that matters to a man like Roy, I don't know. But I think the decision he made in that office to open the door might have been the first honest thing he'd done in a while." Belle thought about this. "There's a version of the world," she said carefully, "where Roy Cutter was never entirely the villain of his own story. There's a version of the world where nobody is entirely the villain of their own story," Daniel said. "That doesn't make what people do less harmful, but it complicates things." "It does," she agreed. They wrote no letter to Roy Cutter and received none. But the held-breath quality of the past eased after Clara's letter and became, gradually, a thing that was finished rather than a thing that was ongoing. In the spring of 1887, their daughter was born. They named her Eleanor after no one in particular, just because both of them heard the name on the same evening and looked at each other simultaneously. Eleanor Harlow arrived in the world with emphatic opinions and a lung capacity that astonished the midwife, and came into her mother's arms as if she had been planning to be there all along. Daniel, who had been considerably more composed at James's birth than he'd expected and considerably less composed for the preceding 12 hours, held Eleanor with the practiced ease of a man who had been holding a small boy for 3 years now, and Eleanor regarded him with her mother's eyes, dark and direct and entirely unintimidated. "She's going to give us trouble," Daniel said, with the contentment of a man who considers this a feature rather than a problem. "She's going to be extraordinary," Belle said. "Same thing," Daniel said. James, 3 years old and very serious about his position as eldest, inspected his sister with the thoroughness of an official assessment and announced that she was acceptable. Daniel managed to maintain his composure for approximately 4 seconds before laughing, which woke Eleanor, who had fallen asleep, which began a round of infant displeasure that took a considerable amount of walking and murmuring to resolve. That evening, with both children finally settled and the house quiet and the New Mexico Territory stars blazing outside the window, Daniel and Belle sat on the porch of the house they had built together, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they watched the dark for a while. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "What part?" "The freedom of it, maybe," she said. The way you were, before all this." He considered it honestly, the way he considered everything. "No," he said, "I don't miss it. I miss things I thought I was getting from it. I thought I was getting justice. I thought I was getting back something that was taken. But you can't recover a thing by taking something else. It just continues the taking. What I was actually getting from it was motion, momentum, not having to stop and build anything because building requires staying, and staying required," he paused. "Staying required hope, and I didn't have any." She turned her head to look at him in profile against the stars. "And now," she said. He looked down at her. "Now I have an embarrassment of it," he said. She kissed him, there on the porch in the dark, and he kissed her back with the same honesty he had given her from the very beginning, and the night held them both. Santiago, their Apache hand, had come to them in the second year with references from Abel Reeves and a work history that was meticulous and a personal history that Daniel did not ask into, and Santiago did not volunteer, though in time the details came out in the natural way that histories emerge between people who spend years working alongside each other. Santiago had been displaced from his people during the Apache campaigns of the early 80s. The brutal, shameful business that Belle wrote about in careful, furious letters to anyone who might read them. The federal representatives and the newspaper editors and the reform societies that were beginning to form in the eastern cities. Daniel supported this work. He had known what injustice looked like from the inside of it for long enough to recognize it wherever it appeared, and he did not pretend that his own wrongs gave him a larger claim to its attention than anyone else's. "The railroad took my family's land," he said once to Belle when they were talking about it late at night. "That was real. That was wrong. But what was done to Santiago's people was a different order of wrong, federal policy, systematic. And I have to be honest about what I did in response to my wrong, which is that I robbed the railroad for years. And while I told myself it was justice, I think a large part of it was rage that wanted a target." "That's not the same thing." "No," Belle said, "it isn't, but I think the honesty of seeing that is the beginning of something better." He did something unexpected in the spring of 1888, which was to write a letter to the Southern Pacific Railroad's regional office in San Antonio, signed with his real name, Daniel Holloway, acknowledging the gold that had been taken in the 1882 payroll robbery, and offering what restitution he could make in the form of labor, at no charge, on any rail infrastructure projects in New Mexico territory. He did not expect them to accept. He was not even sure they would connect the letter to the old case at this distance of years, but he sent it. The response came 8 weeks later. It was not from the railroad, which he had expected. It was from a federal prosecutor named Marshall Webb, based in Santa Fe, who had been assigned to review old Pinkerton cases in the territory as part of a general administrative review. Marshall Webb was a younger man, as it turned out, 32 to Daniel's 31, who had come west from Boston with a law degree and a strong personal conviction that the legal system needed to be better than it often was. He rode out to the Harlow Ranch on a Tuesday in late summer and sat across the kitchen table from Daniel and Belle and drank coffee, and conducted what turned out to be the most important conversation of their lives in the measured, careful tones of someone who has thought very hard about what he intends to say. The letter, Webb explained, had been reviewed in the context of the railroad's own conduct, which the Federal Review had found to include a significant number of irregular land seizures throughout Texas and New Mexico territory during the period from 1875 to 1882. The political climate was shifting. The railroad's power was being examined. And the formal record of Daniel Holloway's activities, set against the context of the original seizure of the Holloway family ranch, presented what Webb called a complicated picture. "I cannot offer you a full pardon," Webb said. "That's above my authority and above the authority of this office. What I can offer is a negotiated resolution, your formal cooperation with the land seizure investigation, your testimony regarding the railroad's activities that you observed firsthand, and in exchange, a prosecutorial agreement that the charges against Daniel Holloway be considered satisfied by the passage of time and demonstrated rehabilitation." Daniel was very quiet through this. Belle was not quiet. She asked every question that needed asking, with the thorough precision of a woman who had been educated in the law of the land as it applied to ordinary people, and intended to understand exactly what was being offered and what was being promised. Webb answered every question. He was patient and direct and clearly respected what he was being asked to explain. In the end, Daniel looked at Belle across the kitchen table and she looked at him, and everything that passed between them in that look was a conversation entire. "What do you need from me?" Daniel said. The testimony took 3 months to prepare and deliver, covering everything Daniel knew about the railroad's practices, the land seizures, the sheriff's offices and county officials who had been paid to facilitate illegal transfers, the names and dates and properties he could verify from his own direct knowledge. It was, Webb said afterward, the most comprehensive account of systematic land fraud he had ever received, and it corroborated and extended several other investigations that had been moving slowly for lack of exactly this kind of insider testimony. The formal resolution came in December of 1888, signed by Webb and 2 federal judges, and carrying the weight of official documentation. Daniel Holloway, formerly of Abilene, Texas, currently of Cimarron Valley, New Mexico Territory, was issued a prosecutorial finding that acknowledged the original unlawful seizure of the Holloway family land as a contributing factor in the events of 1881 through 1883, acknowledged the voluntary restitution of the payroll gold through Thomas Reeves's channels, and determined that the public interest was best served by the closure of the outstanding charges. It was not a pardon. But it was, as Belle said, reading through the document with careful attention to every word, about as close as the law of 1888 was going to get to admitting it had been wrong. Daniel held the document for a long time. "My father worked 40 years to build that ranch," he said. "I know," Belle said. "This doesn't give it back." "No," she said. "It doesn't. Nothing can." He was quiet. "But it means James and Alina don't inherit a wanted man's name," she said. "It means you walk into Cimarron and Santa Fe as who you actually are. It means something." He looked at her. "It means something," he agreed. He kept the document in the same place. He kept the things that mattered most to him, in the small lockbox he had carried since before he could remember, along with the photograph of his parents taken the year before his father died, the horseshoe nail that had started everything, and a pressed wildflower that had come from the high desert plateau north of Redemption Creek. Thomas Reeves married a woman named Patience Garland the following spring, in a ceremony at the Reeves Ranch that Belle organized with the same organized ferocity she brought to everything. And Daniel stood as best man, with the dignity and slight discomfort of a man who is very happy for his friend and slightly uncertain about the formal requirements of standing up in front of people and being still for extended periods. Patience Reeves was a decisive, warm woman who had been schooled in the East and come West for reasons of her own, and thought Belle was the finest human being she had met in the territory, which made them immediate and permanent friends. Their second daughter, born in March of 1890, they named Clara, after a woman in Texas who had made coffee and kept a back room window available at exactly the right moments. When Belle wrote to Clara Pruitt, now Clara Henderson, as she had married the Whittier General Store owner the previous year, she described the baby's arrival in the careful detail of one who knows their reader will treasure it. Clara's letter back was 3 pages long and contained, in its final paragraph, the information that she had finally told Roy Cutter, who had been retired for 2 years now and apparently had taken up vegetable gardening, the general outline of what had happened that day in the back room of the restaurant. Roy had apparently sat in silence for a while and then said, "I figured as much," and then talked about his tomatoes. "He's not a bad man," Clara wrote. "He just couldn't let it go when it would have been better to, but he's not a bad man." Belle read this to Daniel over breakfast. "No," Daniel said, "he never was." James turned 6 that year and started at his mother's school with the seriousness of a child who had been listening to discussions about education his entire life and considered it a matter of personal significance. Alina, 3, watched her brother leave for school each morning with the focused dissatisfaction of someone denied access to something interesting, and conducted herself during school hours with the aggressive reasonableness of a small person, making absolutely certain everyone understood she was being very patient. She started school the following year. By the second day she had opinions about the curriculum. Belle thought this was absolutely wonderful and did not bother to hide it. Daniel had opinions about his daughter's opinions, but they were all positive ones, which he expressed mostly by bringing her interesting things to read and asking her questions, and treating her intellectual engagement as the serious and valuable thing it was. Santiago remained at the Harlow Ranch for 15 years in total, and in that time became, without ceremony or announcement, one of the central figures of their children's growing up. He taught James to track animals and read landscape with a knowledge that came from centuries of accumulated understanding. He taught Alina to sit very still and observe, which served her well in her later life as a botanist. He was invited to every holiday meal and attended every celebration and was treated, because there was no other way to treat him as far as Belle and Daniel were concerned, as a member of the family. The injustice of what had been done to his people was not something any of them could individually repair, and Belle said this directly and often, that acknowledging a wrong and being kind to one person within it was not the same as repairing the systemic harm, and that she would continue to write letters and support organizations until the day she died. But the relationship between Santiago and the Harlow family was real and warm and mutual, and it endured. The fourth child came in the spring of 1893 and was another boy. They named him Thomas because some things were simply obvious, and Thomas Reeves, when informed of this, did not cry at all and was very firm about that. Daniel was 42 by the year 1893, and the lines in his face had deepened into something that Belle found extraordinarily interesting to look at in the way she had found him interesting to look at from the first moment. That quality of absolute honesty, which only became more pronounced as he aged. He was still dangerous in the way a man who has been forged in difficulty is always dangerous, with the quiet competence of someone who has never unlearned what he learned in hard years. But the danger had been entirely redirected, entirely given over to the protection and building of the life they shared, and it expressed itself mostly as thoroughness and reliability, and the absolute certainty that he would be where he said he would be when he said he would be there. She had never once in 11 years gone to sleep not knowing where he was. This was not a small thing. She did not treat it as a small thing. The Harlow Ranch, by 1895, ran 800 head and employed 12 hands, and provided the schoolhouse teacher salary of one permanent position that Belle had formally handed over to a young woman named Rose Chen, who had come west from San Francisco with a teaching certificate and the particular fierce competence of someone who has fought hard for their education. Belle remained as an advisor and occasional substitute and permanent presence on the school board she had organized, but she was not the primary teacher anymore, and she found to her own surprise that this was something close to relief. She had more time. She used the time to write. She had always written in journals and letters, but now she wrote with intention long-considered essays about education on the frontier, about the law as it applied to ordinary people, about the land seizures and what they had done to families across the territory. Some of these were published in territorial newspapers. One was published in a reform journal out of Chicago that had a national circulation and produced a response of letters that took her 3 months to answer. Daniel read everything she wrote. He was her first reader, the way first readers who are also deeply trusted people are first readers, reading not to evaluate but to understand, and his questions were always the ones that made her think harder. "This section," he said once, pointing to a paragraph about the psychological effects of displacement, "you're writing from the outside. You know what the inside feels like." She looked at the paragraph. He was right. "I didn't want to make it personal," she said. "That's what makes it weaker," he said. "The personal is what makes it true." She rewrote the section. The essay was better. She told him this, which he received with the slight self-consciousness of a man who was never entirely comfortable with compliments despite being an extremely perceptive reader. By the last years of the century, Redemption Creek was a different place. Clara wrote that the town had grown, that a second restaurant had opened, and there was talk of connecting to the telegraph line, and that the old sheriff's office had been rebuilt into a proper two-story building with a real magistrate's court on the upper floor. The unfinished church had finally gotten its roof in 1891, and there were now two churches and a possibility of a third. Belle read these letters with the fond, slightly removed attention of someone regarding a place that had been genuinely important to her, and was now genuinely distant, not in miles only but in the particular distance that happens when you have grown entirely into something new. She went back once in 1897, alone, because Daniel was not a man who could easily appear in Roy Cutter's former jurisdiction even with the federal resolution in his pocket, and because some things are better done by the person who has the simplest connection to them. She went back to close the school properly, to attend the town's celebration of the new permanent school building, to which she had contributed financially and been publicly thanked in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, but that she sat through gracefully, because the children deserved the recognition, and she was incidental. She saw Clara, now settled and contented and raising a stepson who had her same practical warmth, and they spent 2 days together that were among the best 2 days of that year. She did not see Roy Cutter. She was told he was doing well and still gardening, and had recently become a grandfather. She left on a Thursday morning as the sun was coming up over the flat country east of town, and she did not feel sad. She felt the clean, full-bodied satisfaction of something that had been genuinely good and genuinely concluded, and she rode toward home. Daniel was waiting at the gate of the ranch when she came down the road, which meant James, who was 13 and responsible and had clearly been tasked with watching for her, had ridden ahead. Daniel had his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back on his head in the way he had when he was working in the yard, and he watched her come down the road with an expression she had never managed to entirely catalog because it kept adding dimensions. She rode up and dismounted, and he stepped forward and held her face in both hands, the way he always did, the way that was entirely his, and looked at her as if verifying that she was whole and present and real. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. "It was good, everything is good." He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, with the unhurried certainty of a man who is home. "The children have been feral," he said. "Thomas got into the paint. All of him or some of him?" "Most of him," he said, "and some of the barn door." She laughed and he grinned, and she put her arm through his, and they walked up toward the house where the paint-decorated youngest child and his older siblings were appearing in the doorway with varying expressions of welcome and guilt. James was serious and tall for 13, with Daniel's dark coloring and Belle's direct gaze. Eleanor was 9 and had already demonstrated abilities in plant identification that had astonished the territorial naturalist who visited the school, and had sent her home with a letter asking if she might correspond about her observations. Clara was 7 and had, as her namesake would have approved of, an absolutely unshakable social confidence and the ability to make anyone feel immediately comfortable. Thomas was 4 and painted. They were, Belle thought, looking at them all together in the doorway of the house they had built, the most complete and improbable thing she had ever been part of. Everything she had thought she was protecting by keeping careful distance from this man had turned out to be far less valuable than what she had found by letting go of the distance. That evening, with the children in bed and the house quiet, she and Daniel sat on the porch again in the dark, and the stars were doing what they always did in New Mexico territory, which was to make every human concern feel simultaneously very small and very significant because they were both things at once. "Daniel," she said. He said. "Do you remember what you said to me the very first time we talked, about territory?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking back. "Mine," he said. "Yes," she said, "that was a deeply arrogant thing to say." "It was," he agreed. "And yet," she said, "it turned out to be entirely true. You claimed a territory, only it turned out to be much larger than either of us knew." He was quiet for a while in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than just comfortable. "No," he said finally. I claimed a territory, but you were the one who built something in it. Everything here," he gestured at the house behind them, the barn dark against the sky, the schoolhouse 100 yards up the road, the land stretching away in every direction. "None of this is something I would have built alone. I didn't know how to build anything before you. I only knew how to take and leave." "You built it with me," she said. "Because of you," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he tucked his arm around her. And the night held them both the way the night had always held them, close and real and true. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, and the mountains stood against the stars, and the ranch was quiet and warm with the sleeping weight of 4 children and a life that had been made, one honest decision at a time, from the ruins of things that had been taken and the courage of things that had been chosen. In the morning there would be work, and there would always be work, and they would do it together the way they had always done it, arguing productively about timelines and listening carefully to each other's assessments, and occasionally surprising each other still, after 15 years, with the depth of what was there. In the morning, James would ask his father another question about the land that his father would answer fully and without condescension. Eleanor would have drawn something in her notebook before breakfast, some plant or insect that she'd observed at first light, and would need to be gently reminded that breakfast came before annotation. Clara would have organized the younger children into some scheme or another, with a social efficiency that made Belle simultaneously proud and slightly wary. Thomas would still have a trace of paint somewhere they hadn't found yet. In the morning, Belle would walk up the road to the schoolhouse and check in with Rose Chen, and talk over the week's curriculum, and feel the deep particular satisfaction of a vocation that extended beyond her own hands. And Daniel would ride out with Santiago to check the eastern fence line and come back at midday, and they would eat together, all of them, at the long table that filled the kitchen, talking and laughing with the comfortable ease of a family that has found its shape. But that was morning. Tonight they sat on the porch of the house they had built, under the stars that had always been here and would be here long after, and the man who had walked into a sheriff's office with both hands raised and said, "Release her," the woman who had stood at iron bars and said, "Don't you dare," held each other in the dark and felt, both of them, the full and extraordinary weight of being exactly where they were supposed to be. The desperate, beautiful, improbable fact of it. Home.